All right, so if you're new to the Sunday sermons, let me just give you a quick tutorial on how these run. This is a very informal and free form sort of session. I do have some prepared comments, but I encourage you to put your own experiences into the chat, to ask questions at any time in the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring both as we go. And then this entire session is recorded and then posted to my YouTube channel. So if you miss anything or have to leave early, you can always go back to my YouTube channel and take a look there. And I'm just going to pop that link into the chat so you've got it. All right. So the first thing I'd like to begin with is actually a little sponsor message, because this year I'm trying something new with my newsletter sponsorships. I'm just throwing in a shout out during my sermons to the current month sponsor. This is for Electric Speed, my free newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks. So February's sponsor is KN Literary Arts. This is a service company that I've known for many years. They offer a range of services to writers, including coaching, editing, ghostwriting, and much more. So if you're curious, need an editor, coach, or something more, you can take a look at their site at knliterary.com, and they do have free consultations. So my thanks to KN for sponsoring my newsletter in February. All right, so today's session is about business setup. This is not a topic, even though I'm known for talking about business, this is not a topic that I typically get into because there are so many different personal concerns that come into play, and I'm not a tax account or like a tax person or an accountant or a lawyer. So it always makes me a little bit reticent to get into some of the details here because I'm not a professional in those fields. And I'm drawing here on my personal experience and some of the few people where I know their business situations really well, and I know some of the choices they've made. So all that to say, please, please, please consult a professional if you need professional guidance at this time. But I am going to give you some things to think about, especially for those of you who have done very little or nothing in regards to business setup. I'm hoping to instill some good practices so that you can avoid some of the headaches and mistakes that I made early in my freelance career. Okay, so speaking of freelance career, I have been a freelancer for a long time now. I started out doing side gigs. So I was formally employed through 2014? Yes, through 2014, I was a salaried employee of either a publishing company or a university. But since the mid 2000s, I have done freelance work of some kind, meaning I would, get paid on the side by someone who was not my employer. This usually means you get 1099s. Probably most of you are familiar with 1099s. This is what you get as an independent contractor or freelancer. So I always had those 1099s that at tax time, and I would have a Schedule C on my tax return. And I usually would take all of this over to an accountant, in whatever town I was living in, and we would sit down at the accountant's desk for a couple hours and punch it all out. And it was actually pretty straightforward to do this because my business was not complicated. So for those of you who are familiar with Schedule C, that's what I did for, 7, 8, 9 years. And I never made enough where I had to really pay that much attention to the accounting. I didn't really have much in the way of expenses. So it was very kind of easy peasy, no worries. There were no quarterly taxes. But at some point, the Excel method of dealing with this was not sufficient, especially in 2014 when I went full-time freelance. And so, of course, when you start earning lots of money as a freelancer, you start to see the limitations of Excel. You start to see the limitations at tax time of doing it that way because you don't have all the information you need at your fingertips, and you've forgotten half of what happened in the early part of the year, et cetera. So all that to say, if you are currently using Excel or Post-it notes or Word documents to keep track of your business finances and what's happening income and expense-wise, I really, really encourage you to take steps today to formalize it, even if you feel like it's not necessary, even if your earnings are quite small, just because you're going to thank yourself later for having the structures in place. It was very painful the first few years that I was a freelancer, because I was always scrambling to figure out what state my business was in and trying to communicate that to people like accountants. All right, so in 2015, that's after I was a full-time freelancer for about a year. That's when I started to get really serious about the setup and think beyond the Schedule C on my tax return. And this is in my early freelance days. I actually didn't even have a dedicated home office. I would just sit in the kitchen where my cat had easy access to sit right in front of me and interrupt everything. I see that Jessica mentions in the chat that she just engaged a bookkeeper and accountant after years of Schedule C and TurboTax, and it relieved a ton of stress I didn't even realize I had. I have totally been there, and I feel you. So the initial steps that I took to relieve that stress and burden was, number one, I started using an accounting software. I use Wave Accounting. I think it's a great way to get started if you've never before used something official, like if you don't use Quicken, if you don't use, what are some of the other FreshBooks? If you don't use anything like that yet, I do recommend starting with Wave because it's free and it has a gentle learning curve. They also have a lot of good tutorials. They have good support. And so I kind of stumbled into Wave. I'm not going to say it by accident exactly, but I was just looking for a solution to help me, like at least short term, because I figured when I grew up and became a real adult, I would end up using Quicken or something from the Quicken library of software. But I found actually that Wave does everything I needed to. And when I sheepishly admitted to my accountant that I used Wave, which is free, they're like, oh, that's great. That works fine. And I wasn't made to feel bad or guilty about not using something more official. So in any event, here on the slide, I do have a couple screen captures of what it looks like when you're in Wave and looking at your expenses and looking at your income. So it has a really nice interface and aesthetic. If you're not an accountant, I don't think it's going to be intimidating, which is one of the reasons that I recommend it. The other thing I did in 2015 is I finally established an LLC. This is in the state of Virginia, where I currently live. This was pretty inexpensive. I'm going to talk more about LLCs in a minute. It was only $100 to establish the LLC. That fee is specific to the state of Virginia. I also obtained an employer identification number known as an EIN from the government. This is a federal number, and I now use that instead of my social security number on W-9s. So whenever you're working for a company, doing freelance work, they ask you for that W-9 where you fill out your name and address, and they ask you for your social security number. Well, now instead of putting my social security number on these forms, I would use the EIN. I also opened up a business banking account and a business credit card, something I should have done eons earlier, because it's, if any of you have more experience than I had at that time, you should set up separate accounts for your business rather than intermingling your personal and business finances. It took me a long time to create that wall, which I strongly recommend that you do. And then finally, because I was earning a considerable amount, I had to start paying quarterly estimated taxes. And this is both at the federal and the state level. I see we've got MT mentioning, I've used Quicken for years. I'm still a sole proprietor and I can separate out my writing expenses for Schedule C. It works, but I wonder whether to set up an LLC. So here are the pros and cons. So this is, one of the key benefits, I hope, of today's sermon for those of you who are thinking about this. I think the pros are from a standpoint of creditors coming after you. An LLC separates your personal assets from your business assets. So if you have any concerns on that level, It's usually pretty straightforward to set up the LLC and you get that protection. You have flexibility in how you're taxed, which I was very interested in. I'm going to talk more about that later. Depending on what business you're in, you might look more credible to clients with that business LLC name. So here I'm thinking like if you work for big corporations, if you work in certain industries, they might just take you more seriously if you have that business entity rather than, it's just some individual that looks like a fly-by-night. Now, there's lots of different ways of looking professional. I'm not saying that you won't look professional without an LLC, but context is everything. So it could be helpful to you. And then you yourself, just the psychological the psychological ramifications of taking these steps. You might take your activities, your writing and publishing activities more seriously now that you have these formal accounts and this formal designation for what you do. Now, there are drawbacks. Some states have significant fees for establishing and maintaining an LLC. I think California might be the most expensive or the most problematic if this is a concern for you. When I was in a partnership arrangement on a publication, this was Scratch Magazine, for those who go back with me that far, my business partner was based in California. And we decided that the LLC we were forming was going to be based in Virginia because it was so much cheaper to operate it from Virginia. So you do need to check your state to see what sort of burden there might be. Some states, there might not be much or any tax savings for an LLC. Again, I'm going to get to that a little later. You do remain responsible for your own wrongdoing. So even though there are pros for separating the personal assets and business assets, some types of litigation, it's not going to make a difference whether or not you had an LLC or not when someone sues you. So there are ways, though, to protect yourself that would be either in addition to the LLC or instead of the LLC, which I'll mention later. And cherry on top here for the cons, if you relocate to another state, there's going to be complications for you because LLCs are specific to the state that you formed it in. And so you will either have to form it again in the state you move to. You will have to do something called domestication if your states allow it. And so there's all sorts of legal problems that go with relocation into LLCs, and you would likely have to hire a lawyer to help you. Let's see. MT also asks, have you considered estate planning pros and cons of an LLC? I have, to a limited extent, insofar as I've actually done some estate planning recently. And it was very straightforward to put in that estate planning document, look, I want all of the assets, I want all of the intellectual property of this LLC to go to X individual or X organization, or I want the whole thing dissolved or liquidated, and I want the proceeds to go in this direction. So yes, I think it's having just gone through that process, last year, I think it does make it much cleaner to say this LLC, this is exactly what should happen to it, rather than talking about some business that, isn't clear and well-defined. Jen mentions, I established a LLC in late 1990 in Delaware, even though I never lived there. Her research was that you didn't have to live in the state where your LLC is established, and it might be different now. That's my understanding too. I believe you can establish an LLC in any state you like. This is where I can't really give advice on what state to choose, if there would be an advantage to choosing a different state. I think there are tax implications, of course. So I think possibly one reason you would not do that is because you might have a double taxation issue, but I don't know. I think it's usually, I think you do need an agent in the state wherever your LLC is. So you'll have to pay attention to that as well. So yes, you can operate a LLC in a state you don't live in, but there are going to be additional headaches, and you will have to research what those are. Andrea mentions, I live in expensive California. Is there an alternative to an LLC? Not that I'm aware of, Andrea, but ask around. I imagine, you're not the only person who's a little bit reticent to get involved in an LLC in California. So I would start Googling around to see what the solutions are, or if people just have to kind of put up with the burden, or it doesn't make sense to create an LLC in another state. I don't know, but I imagine you're not the first person to deal with this problem. Wish I had a better answer for you, though. Okay. Before I continue with the LLC discussion, I just want to also mention there can be city or county business requirements. So like some cities and counties, they require you to get a business license. Some might have specific taxes they assess on your business. Some types of businesses, though, are tax exempt. So, for example, here in Charlottesville, Virginia, when I went to, the city hall, and talked to them about the Scratch magazine that I was running in partnership with my friend in California, I was told that publications of that nature were tax exempt, and so we paid no taxes. I think this can be a really huge headache too. We're going to talk more about state taxes on your business later, but every city and county and state is different in what they tax, and so you have to really look at the fine print, or if there's a small business center in your city, where they help people with small business issues, I would definitely ask them for guidance on this. Okay. So there are different types of LLCs. This is where things get super interesting, I think. Most people are going to start off as a single member LLC. This is how I started. And so this is the most straightforward to set up. You pay taxes on your personal return. There's no separate return for the LLC. And you basically pay taxes as you would as a sole proprietor. So it's because it's so simple, for most people, it's not a big hurdle to do that single member LLC unless there's a lot of fees associated with it in your state. A multi-owner LLC is when you're not the only person involved with the business. So like with Scratch Magazine, that was a partnership LLC, and both of us were listed as owners 50-50. This might not apply to those of you attending today, especially if you're just interested in this for your own personal work. But as soon as you get into a business partnership of any kind, where there's an LLC, you are now engaging in a multi-owner LLC. And of course, that just increases the complexity of what happens, especially at tax time. Finally, and this is what I have, after I established the single member LLC, I would say within a year or two, I don't remember the exact timing, I switched to an LLC S Corp. So this means I get taxed as an S Corp. This is more of a complicated setup. I used my accountant to set this up. They filed the paperwork, which I note, I specifically want to call that out because for the single member LLC, I was able to do that myself online. Wasn't a big deal. But as soon as I switched to this S Corp formation, I did have an accountant take care of all of that for me. It means that I have essentially two tax returns. I've got my personal return, and then I've got the return associated with the LLC. But the reason I do this is for tax savings. I will get to that. Patty says, silly question. There is no silly questions here. If I establish as an LLC, do I still need a business license? And maybe it depends on the state. So it's definitely not a silly question. I think this is a super confusing issue, and it does depend on where you live, not just the state you live in, but the city that you live in. So you need to Google something like, I live in Charlottesville, so I would Google Charlottesville business license, something like that, and you'll find information that your city has. Shamika asks, will setting up a LLC in the next few weeks help me with my tax returns this year? I don't think so. I don't think you can have it apply to the prior year. So it would certainly help you for 2022 tax year, but I don't think it's going to have any benefit for you in 2021, to my knowledge. So this raises the question, aside from, the fees, how hard is it to set this up and maintain? Is it going to be worth the work involved? I was able to create my single member LLC, the simple one, not the S Corp, but just the starting one, through the state of Virginia website. It was a very straightforward form. I put in my credit card information to pay my $100, and I was an LLC in like less than an hour. Like, that's how easy it was. It was shockingly easy. I didn't really need to give them any further information than the fact that I was the 100% owner. This is my address. I'm the agent. They call it an agent, the person who's the formal person that is contacted for the business. They have some fancy names for some of the stuff, like articles of organization. It sounds intimidating. It's not, at least not in Virginia. It was probably easier than opening a bank account. Like, I was just so surprised at how easy it was. Now, you do need to choose an LLC name that's unique in your state. My LLC name is Jane Friedman Media LLC. And your state probably has tools right on its business website, like their Chamber of Commerce probably has some research tools for you to double check whether or not your name is all right. Obviously, there are also some trademark issues too. You want to make sure you're not, like, you wouldn't want to call yourself Dunkin' Donuts if you're opening a donut shop, because that's a trademark problem. But most writers and authors, usually there aren't any trademark issues. Usually there aren't unique issues if you're, just at least adding a word or two to your name. If you start getting into things not associated with your name, then definitely do your research and make sure you're not going to be stepping on someone else's toes. MT mentions that sometimes when you're setting up a business bank account, the bank will set up an LLC for you. And my husband's bank did this for his business. That's fabulous. The banks here, to my knowledge, don't do that. But if you can find a bank that does that, thumbs up. Okay, so back to what you will have to do. So you're going to choose your LLC name. You're going to apply for the EIN. That is also an instant sort of thing. You go to the federal government website for this. You fill out the information, and bam, like, you immediately get your EIN like within minutes, and it's free. And then after you've created all of this, you're going to renew that LLC every year. The state will notify you it's time. You'll pay your $50 or whatever the renewal fee is. And that's all. That's basically all you have to do in most states to remain in good standing. Just stay up to date with the fees. But as with everything I'm saying here, you need to double check the requirements in your state just to make sure you're ticking all the boxes. But by and large, there's not a whole lot of maintenance work aside from that renewal, if it's a single member LLC. So let me talk about the more complicated step where the tax rewards come into play, at least for some people. There's a special term you should know, if you don't know it already, called a pass-through entity. So an LLC, a single member LLC, and a multi-member LLC, these are called pass-through entities. So that means the business income or losses from the LLC are passed directly onto the owners, that's you, and then you pay taxes on that income on your individual tax return. Forming as an LLC S Corp, it's still considered a pass-through entity, so it still works in the same way. But what happens with the S Corp is you start paying yourself a salary. And that way you avoid what's called the double taxation effect of being self-employed. I think most of you have probably heard about the self-employment tax, where you end up paying taxes on your income and also the so-called payroll taxes. So doing the LLC S Corp allows you to have a more favorable tax situation by having that double taxation on your salary, but not on the rest of the business's income. I hope that makes sense. Suffice to say, you should have an accountant help you with this, and have them set up the S Corp for you. And then you would definitely want to have an accountant do your taxes for the S Corp. And I think also for your personal taxes. So they're going to do the whole thing for you, and you're going to have those two returns. Now, if you choose to go down this path, you do need to be earning enough money to make it worth the headache here and the extra fees you're going to be paying to your accountant. It depends on the state, but I would say 50,000 that's where you're starting to get to the point at which it makes sense to go through these extra hoops and pay the extra money. So you are going to pay yourself a salary, and you're going to have to use a payroll services company to do this. I use a service called Gusto, costs about $50 a month, and it's a very hands-off sort of system. I just tell Gusto what my salary is, the state that I live in, and it does the rest. It files all the paperwork that needs to be filed. It pays all the taxes that need to be paid, and then it issues reports and W-2s and all of the things that you need now, because you are now your own employer, issuing yourself a W-2. So I get a W-2 every year from Jane Friedman Media LLC, and that W-2 is reflected on my taxes. And then I also have income that comes from the S Corp that also filters through to my personal taxes, which is taxed at a more advantageous rate than the salary. Note, for those of you living in New York State, as far as I am aware, at least based on what I've read recently from accountants in New York, an LLC S Corp may not be advantageous to you tax-wise. They just don't have the same sort of tax brackets, as I understand it, for S Corp earnings for an LLC. So I apologize to those of you in New York that you don't get this benefit. Okay, I'm going to check the chat here. Alice says, I set my LLC up with LegalZoom. It seemed affordable. It was helpful, but they claimed to be my registered agent and started charging me $300 a year. And I found out that in New York, I didn't need a registered agent. So I did the paperwork and no longer get charged by LegalZoom. Alice, I'm so glad you brought this up, because I do see a lot of services out there that say, hey, we'll set up your LLC for you at this low fee and we'll take away the headache and blah, blah, blah. But I think for a good majority of states, you don't need someone to do this for you. It's not rocket science. It's not even as hard as filing your taxes. It just seems maybe scary and intimidating if you've never done it before. But it's not complicated for most people if it's a single member LLC. And I don't think you need these services, which if they are charging you recurring fees, I would really question whether that's necessary. I would much rather see, like, if you have an accountant and you want to make sure that all of the I's are dotted and T's are crossed with your LLC formation, have your accountant help you out, and be your own registered agent is what I would recommend, unless you're in a unique scenario. Emily says, I'm not sure whether this applies to someone who uses their name for their business, but in my case, in California, my business name is different. So I had to first go to the county clerk and apply for a fictitious name for my company, then take that paperwork to the bank to set up my business account. She's offering that as an FYI. So I'm glad you brought that up, Emily, because there are some like doing business as fictitious name forms that you have to file. If you're doing business as something other than your name, which could be important for some of you. So thank you for bringing that up, Emily. Melissa says, I live in 2 places and I'm so confused about which place to set up shop in. Any tips on who to ask, accountant or lawyer or both? I would ask your accountant about that. They should be able to give you some really good advice about what makes sense for your situation. Okay. So I'm going to move away from the LLC discussion now and talk more about taxes. This is not about personal taxes or business taxes, but about collecting and remitting sales tax. So on the services and products you sell as an LLC, do you need to be collecting taxes and remitting those to the city or to the state or whomever? Unfortunately, it's complicated. It's really, really complicated. And I'm not even getting into like the European Union tax issues that can come into play here. If you have EU customers, like your head will start to spin. There is a really good website called TaxJar. TaxJar has state by state information and guidance about what's taxable in your state and what might happen if you're an LLC established in one state, selling goods in another. Like there are so many different variations of what can happen here. It's really hard to keep track of. Different states have different guidelines on what's taxed and what's not. Like here in Virginia, webinars don't incur sales tax, which is why I don't charge it. Oftentimes digital services don't incur sales tax, but sometimes digital products like software do incur sales tax. There's a lot of gray area. So that's why there are sites and services like TaxJar. TaxJar actually offers, a way to get rid of the sales tax headache by, if you like install it on your site, or if you're dealing with sales tax issues, it will help remit those taxes for you, will calculate them appropriately, and then remit them for you on a regular basis. There are other services out there aside from TaxJar, but if you're going to be an LLC and selling things online, then you'll definitely need to research this. All right, so back to normal, well, not normal, back to personal taxes, or the annual taxes that you file, your federal and state taxes. Again, I'm just going to go back to the Wave suggestion. Even if you don't use Wave, just find a single spot for all of your stuff. I think one of the key things here is you don't want multiple tracking systems. You want everything to be as centralized as possible. And what I like about Wave is that it also hooks in, as many systems do, it hooks right into my business accounts. So, it's tracking cash flow in the accounts, things coming in and going out. And what I do, or rather what Mark does on a monthly basis, is he does a monthly reconciliation. So this is where and Wave actually has a button called reconcile or reconciliation, where you just look at all of the transactions and you check off, yes, this is accurate. Yes, this is accurate. And you balance the books. So if you do that on a monthly basis, using a system like Wave, once tax time rolls around, everything's reconciled. Once you get all of your forms in, like your 1099s or, whatever it is that people are sending you, by this time of the year, if your books are balanced and you've got all your forms, you can send that off to your accountant and you really don't have to do anything else because it's all accounted for and sitting there in your accounting system. So this makes it truly a stress-free situation. Now, there are accountants who will also do the reconciliation for you. Obviously, this comes with some significant costs. But if you're earning enough money or you really don't want to deal with it, you can have someone balance the books for you on a monthly basis. An MT mentions that even if you're not an LLC, if you're selling physical books or other products as an individual, you have to pay sales tax in most states, even if your sales are minimal. That is correct. I'm not going to suggest tax dodging. I would never do that. I will say that a lot of authors I see who are selling things like at events or like book festivals and things, like the amount being sold is so minimal that I don't think you're going to get tracked down or chased down by the IRS. But I'm not suggesting you not do what's right, but just be aware that sometimes the sales are minimal enough that you're not going to be triggering, or it's if. Let me back up and say, give an example, because I think this is really useful. The Association of Writers and Writing Programs, if you're familiar with that conference, it attracts like 10,000 people every year. It's going to be in Philadelphia this year. They have a book fair. And some years, the book fair, you're allowed to sell books and things at that book fair. And usually AWP has very specific instructions for the sales tax situation and what has to be done in order to remit the sales tax. And those sorts of like environments where the standards and expectations are very clear and you have a path to paying and remitting those taxes, you should absolutely be doing it. But in other cases, let's say more informal situations, it's going to be based on your risk tolerance. So I want to be realistic about what actually happens in practice. But thank you, MT, for pointing out that even if you're not an LLC, there are sales tax implications for selling books and things. All right. Now, you want to make sure that you account for all expenses because obviously this reduces your tax burden. If you are working from home and you have a dedicated office space for your business, you can take a home office deduction, talk to your accountant about it. If you are paying subscription services, if you're paying for software, technology for writing, website hosting, MailChimp, Canva, if you're traveling to conferences, if you have meals and things, all of that stuff, if it's related to your business of writing and publishing, is tax deductible. People you hire to do your social media management or your publicity work or proofreading and designing, that is part of your expenses and that's deductible. However, note that once you pay above a certain amount, $600, I believe is the amount, you may need to issue 1099s. So just as you receive 1099s for freelance work you do, when you hire freelancers and pay more than a certain amount, you may need to issue 1099s. That's a question as well for your accountant, whether that is necessary. If you're paying another LLC organized as an S Corp, my understanding of the tax law is that you do not have to issue 1099s for LLC S Corps. I still get a bunch of 1099s, even though I'm an LLC S Corp, because I don't think that distinction, most people don't understand that it's there and that I don't need the 1099. Okay. Debbie says, do you keep track of classes, webinars, promotional giveaway expenses before your first book is out there and creating income? Yes. I know that there is, I've heard accountants give this talk countless times about how when you start filing taxes and claiming losses on your writing and publishing business, if you claim a loss all the time and never show any income, the IRS might start to get suspicious about what's going on. So I think it's totally normal to start, it's totally normal to have losses and to incur expenses before you would have any income, but do talk to your accountant about when you're entering territory that you don't want to be in, like getting audited, or if you're bottom line is if you're always taking a loss and never seeing income, the IRS doesn't consider you quite serious. Okay. Earlier, I mentioned that forming an LLC does protect you if creditors come after it. That protects your personal assets if creditors come after you. It doesn't necessarily protect you if there's going to be some sort of malpractice suit or like you personally are accused of wrongdoing. There is insurance you can buy. Especially liability insurance might be useful for those who are providing services or blogging. People who are in my sort of business, it can give you some peace of mind to have liability insurance. It just covers you against legal action related to your work. There's a company that specializes in what I consider affordable insurance for freelancers. It's called Dingy. Just go to their website. And I have to say, I've dealt with all sorts of insurance quoting for liability and other types of writerly insurance over the years. And Dingy was just amazing in its ability to give you a quote and offer you coverage without having to talk on the phone or go through really fine print applications. It's really stunning how it's evolved into something where, yes, I feel like I can actually buy this and it's not going to cost me a fortune. So I do recommend checking them out if you are earning a significant amount or if you feel like you're exposed in some way by the type of work that you do. Jen says, my past experience is that anytime after 3 years of losses increases your risk of an audit. This was advice from my accountant. So that sounds like a good rule of thumb. All right, so that's all of the formal planned comments that I have. I'm gonna give everyone a few minutes to throw any questions that they have into the Q&A box or into the chat. While that's happening, I'll just mention a couple of the resources I have available for folks. I've got paid online classes, 3 a month. If you haven't seen those, you can take a look at my site under the online classes tab. And then Sunday sermons happen about 6 times a year. You can find those under the Sunday business sermons section of online classes. I'm also starting something called Business Clinic. Some of you may have seen the business clinics that I did late last year. One was on author websites. One was on what to do when you're drowning in work with Allison K. Williams. So there are going to be more business sermons coming. There's one scheduled for March. You can find that again under the online classes tab at my website. All right, so just checking the Q&A box here. Jen asks if I'm able to send out the slides. Yeah, if you just email me, I'll put that into the chat here. If you just email me at courses@janefriedman.com, I'm happy to send you a copy of the slides. Debbie asks, do you separate your author from your classes, speaking, etc.? I assume you mean like author income. So no, for me, it all goes into a single bucket. Everything falls under Jane Friedman Media, LLC. All of the income falls under that AIN. And I have essentially no personal income aside from like income that might come from like interest on my bank account or like the mortgage interest, 1099, stuff like that is certainly in my personal name, but everything else falls under the EIN. Where do I list the business clinics is the question. Let me just do a quick screen share here of my website and I can show you where that is. So if you go to the online classes tab, you see there are the paid classes, business clinic, and then business sermons. The business clinic is right there. And if you're interested in being considered for a future business clinic, there's actually an application form. All right. Mona says, if I have a portion of my book sales donated to a nonprofit, how do you handle this during taxes? I don't know, Mona, but my assumption would be that it would fall under whatever charitable contributions you're making. So like my accountant always asks me, what nonprofits did you give money to during this year? And then that's, that helps offset the tax burden. So my assumption is that if you were donating your proceeds to a nonprofit, that's how it would be handled. Susanna says, I got an EIN about 5 years ago, but then I never got a formal employment at a company and never used the EIN for taxes. But now I'm freelance again, and can I use that old EIN going forward? I don't see why not. I don't believe they expire. I mean, they are, I'm trying to think, I think they're connected to the LLC specifically that you've established. So if that LLC has dissolved or is no longer, then you wouldn't be able to use it. But if that LLC still exists, and you're still in the same state, like everything about that LLC is in good standing, I don't see why you couldn't use it. Andrea says, if I form an LLC, but also teach for a university sometimes or for other platforms, in those cases, does it fall under my name or my LLC? This is a curious thing. And I'm glad you brought it up, Andrea, because earlier I said, all the work I do, all of the things that I'm paid for goes into the Jane Friedman Media LLC bucket, everything. because I use that EIN on every bit of writing and publishing work that I do. However, there are some contracts and agreements I signed prior to having that LLC and EIN. So for instance, the Great Courses thing that I did, it was signed as Jane Friedman with my social security number. I'm trying to think if the same thing is true for the University of Chicago Press. But here's what happened in effect, or here's what currently happens in effect. I think you have two choices. One is you can let it be, and then ask your accountant to have those things that are falling onto your social security number that are really part of your business, like your LLC. It's really should be classified as LLC earnings. You can have them claim it as part of the LLC S Corp. That's what happens for me with the Great Courses, even though it's hitting my social security number technically, they are applying it to the LLC S Corp. So you can tell your accountant and take care of it that way if you would like for it to be under that formation. The other thing you can do is contact whomever you're dealing with. Like I could maybe contact Great Courses and say, look, I want to change the setup there. Can we do that? And they say yes or no, and you continue. And so that would be, I guess, a cleaner way of doing it so that you're not having anything hit your social security number. But as I've mentioned, your accountant should be able to help you with that if you have any legacy things falling under the social security number. Anytime you're in an independent contractor situation, like not a W-2 employer situation, anytime it's a 1099 situation, I would encourage you to use the business name and the business EIN. I can't think of a reason why you wouldn't if it's part of your business. Irene asks, how does this work if you write under a pen name? I would say that not a whole lot changes because like for Amazon, like if you're writing under a pen name and publishing through Amazon, you input your tax information, which really actually has no bearing on the name you publish under. So you can publish under any name you want. And then under the tax information, you put in the tax information of your LLC or your social security number or whatever, like how you file with the IRS. I think where issues come into play is where you need a doing business as, or if you need to have fictitious name. So that's one area where I don't have a lot to tell you because I don't have to do that myself. But if you may need to check with an accountant or with a lawyer about any requirements for a DBA or operating under a fictitious name. But just as generally speaking, if we're talking about like publishing books under a pen name and getting your income from Amazon or Ingram, there's not really an issue with that. Someone says, I just checked an old EIN file, but it looks like it is connected to an old business name that I no longer use. Assume I'm going to need a new one. Yes, that would be my assumption. I think you're going to need a new one. Andrea asks, did your multi-LLC partnership continue when you formed the S Corp, and how did you manage that? Oh, Andrea, you're asking the good questions. So this really gets into some of the pain points of LLC formation. So I've created in my career 3 LLCs. I created the Scratch Magazine LLC, which began as a partnership. I've created Jane Friedman Media LLC, which is now an S Corp. I've also created the Hot Sheet LLC, which began as a partnership as well. With the Scratch LLC, I dissolved it when the partnership ended. And it was really a no muss, no fuss situation. There were no taxes that we had to owe because it's a pass-through entity that, it's not paying taxes. So when you dissolve it, as long as there are no complications between you and your partner about who gets what, it's very easy to dissolve it and it's a done thing. With the Hot Sheet, that partnership was a buyout situation. So I bought out my partner and the LLC continued. And it continued as a single member LLC, which I only figured out after the fact was a really, really important transition that required me to immediately file taxes, even though it was in August when this happened. I ended up paying a tax penalty because I didn't tell my accountant about this. He wasn't able to tell me I needed to file taxes right away. I figured, well, it's still the same LLC. Nothing has changed except that now I own 100% of it. But in the eyes of the state, that is a really significant change that required a tax filing immediately. So I ended up paying a significant bill there for not doing my due diligence. Today, Jane Friedman Media LLC is essentially kind of the only LLC I run, because the Hot Sheet LLC is now kind of, let's say, tucked under Jane Friedman Media. So instead of having 3 tax filings, in other words, my personal Jane Friedman Media and Hot Sheet, instead of having 3 different returns, I have 2 returns. I have my personal return, and then I have Jane Friedman Media, and Hot Sheet LLC is folded underneath. I can't tell you much about how that all happened or the logistics of it because my accountant took care of it. But I think for a lot of reasons, if you end up with 2 different LLCs, they're both single member LLCs, probably for streamlining and to reduce, the admin burden, you're likely going to have them folded under one of the LLCs. I hope that makes sense. I even only half quite understand what entirely happened there. But the one thing, to more directly answer the question you asked, Andrea, the multi-partnership scratch, that didn't continue, and it was its own entity anyway. And then the Hot Sheet did continue, and then it got folded under. So that's the really fast answer. And I know more about LLCs than I would like because of those situations. Okay, I'm going to check the chat here. Karen says, I live in one of those expensive LLC states, so I haven't yet gone down that road. Is an EIN a good thing to have even without having an LLC? I could be wrong, but I think you have to have an LLC in order to get an EIN. I think that's true. I'm not sure it's possible to have one without the LLC. And Emily's offering some information on the fictitious business name statement, the DBA. Thank you for that, Emily. And Adam asks, could you put in a chat box to KN Literary? Yes, I'm happy to do that. Thank you. I'm sure they appreciate you asking, Adam. There we go. That link should work, I hope. Yes, and there's their site. MT says you can get an EIN if you're an individual who hires people, so you can pay employment taxes. So there you go. It sounds like you should be able to get an EIN anyway. Thank you for that. All right. So that concludes today's sermon. Thank you all so much for joining me once again. There will be another one coming up in April, and it's going to be an open Q&A specifically on email newsletters. So in the past, I've done open Q&As. In the future, I'm going to try and keep them focused on a single topic so we have a little bit more cohesion and focus. So if you're interested in email newsletter creation, marketing, sponsorships, please join me for that session. Have a great weekend and see you soon. Bye-bye.